Hi, everybody, and welcome back again to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we are attempting to give an Olympian judgment on issues of religion, culture, and history, and why they matter. But of course, as usual, it's another foggy day, and so we do our best. And my name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and this is the second episode in our series on my now rather elderly book, Why the Rest Hates the West, which still, its themes are still pretty contemporary. So we felt that it was worth revisiting that. If some of our viewers feel a little up in the air with this present discussion, we really would urge you to go back and look at the last episode, episode 1 in this series, which gives the backstory to this book and lays out in the later part of that episode what this book is really all about and what it's trying to do. What we're doing in today and in subsequent episodes is shark in on some particular themes within the book that deal with matters that have created and continue to create deep alienation between the West and the rest, and which Westerners often fail to understand, but the clue to which is frequently, not always, but frequently in our own past. Because the West is the society that's most thoroughly modernized, and in more recent times maybe postmodernized itself. And outside of that, lots of people, sometimes still living in pre-modern conditions, but even where they're not, have a far more strongly pre-modern mindset. And so these are the kinds of ways of thinking that we're going to be discussing here.
Something that I wanted to ask you last time that, frankly, we just ran out of time for is that wonderful individualistic question of why does this matter to me? Why should I care? And I think part of the answer to that is that you mentioned last week that your book received a lot more attention after the 9/11 attacks and sort of the US going through this period of terrorism. And I think you probably even have said that in the book, but just that sort of time that the US went through, or some people would claim is still going through, is a product of people not understanding this discussion that we're having.
Right. I mean, one of the things that struck me very forcefully was that there was not an awful lot of interest in my book project before 9/11, and afterwards there suddenly was. I mean, in the US case, there were, I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was something like 5 or 6 offers to take it. So, yes, Westerners had the luxury for a long time of remaining oblivious, sometimes even on principle, to the ways the rest of the world thought. And that was always obnoxious. But now it's not merely that, it actually does us serious harm. And if you remember, this is one of the things I pushed very strongly at you and students when you were taking the East Meets West program, that we need this, even if one wanted to ignore the sort of the moral side of it, the moral blandishments of people like me, in our own interests, to be able to function without immediately alienating people whose cooperation, ideally friendship, we needed. And I think, I mean, obviously I couldn't possibly claim like some sort of 100% success rate, but I think that a lot of the students that went through that program, it did shake up their ways of thinking and made them much more willing to engage and to realize that they could. Right? That this wasn't something that somehow beyond them. I don't know, do you, it's a while ago now for you, but do you recall that as being something of a process?
Yes, absolutely. And I was going to say, on the surface level, I think, especially as a college student, you could kind of look at this and go, well, I'm really not planning on going into politics or foreign relations. And so, again, why should this apply to me? But I think, and I think this is what you probably said to us, is that the way that you think about these things changes your worldview, quote unquote, and your worldview, whether you realize it or not, impacts the way that you do go about life on a daily basis. And so I do consider myself extremely fortunate that I went through the program, and I suppose fortunate that you were there as the part of it. But I'm still debating whether that's good fortune or bad. But
I'm sure your husband and all your relatives do have opinions on this point.
yes,
But more
right,
seriously,
right,
I mean, I
yes,
think it enables, quite apart from anything else, it enables one to see one's own society with far greater clarity, because you can
yes.
see realistically alternatives in all kinds of things. I mean, this is one of the things that one comes up with studying history as well, that it enables one to see one's own society with much greater clarity, because you can, when confronted by any particular phenomenon, mentally hold half a dozen different comparison points to it. Well, let's get in with it today, which is the whole idea of tradition, progress, and going nowhere. So, pre-modern people, and by that we mean those even in the West before about, say, the 16th century, and then decreasingly so over the couple of hundred years after that. And in the non-West, right up to much more recent times, typically pre-modern people really believed in tradition and the duty of following the ways of their ancestors. Their whole lives were shaped by a particular tradition. They didn't view it as something quaint. They considered it central to the meaning of their collective life. And as we found in the West itself, as it modernized, all sorts of forces kicked back against that, as people felt themselves and the fundamental meanings and shape of their lives to be under some kind of threat. And the more modernized Westerners, of course, derided them for, out of touch idiots, and have eventually won that battle. And now the same kind of bile, is that really the right word, is directed outside the West. But again, he gets that kind of pushback from people outside the West who don't necessarily want their cultures and their ways of doing things and the security that gives them, not just psychologically but even economically, upended by vast sudden innovation.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, but I think the trouble is that they feel like in order to modernize and progress like the West has, that you have to give up some of these things in order to modernize that way.
And that may be the trade-off. Yeah, as I think we mentioned last time, many people want our kind of standard of living, but they don't want to pay the kind of psychic, spiritual, cultural, social price for it, moral price.
Right.
And is that possible? Can they become modernized in some technological and creature comfort sense without also being culturally deracinated in the process? Not sure whether it's possible, but we sure should be inclined to try and help and encourage them to do that rather than what we're actually doing. Well, just imagining ourselves back in that pre-modern situation, we need to remember, quick reality check here. I mean, even in the West itself, life expectancy in the early 20th century was late 40s, early 50s. Before that, and in much of the non-West until very recent times, it was anywhere on a range from high 20s to mid 40s, average life expectancy, right? Depending on the period of history, the country we're looking at, and so on. And so old people were rare, and you looked to them for wisdom because, by definition, they had more experience than anybody else in the group, and most people lived in small settlements and were not literate. So they were your reference point, and they were success stories by definition. They'd managed to stay alive. And our ancestors were success stories by definition, because if they hadn't survived and succeeded in passing their ways of life, and we might nowadays say their genes, on to us, we wouldn't be here. So it made enormous sense. And the person who pushed back against that in favour of doing something new was considered arrogant and selfish. So now I think we can already see how that grates with modern sensibilities, right? We consider this to be extremely tiresome. So pre-modern people typically saw their lives as a link in a chain running from the past to the future. And we don't see our lives like that anymore. We go to ancestry.com or tune into these TV programs like Who Do You Think You Are and this kind of thing, right? But it's really kind of antiquarian interest, maybe a bit more passionate than that, because we feel rootless and lost, because we are. But we certainly don't really feel a strong sense of obligation to that ancestry, even insofar as we know it. We're going to plough our own furrows. So they saw their lives very differently. And they saw their duty as bequeathing to their descendants, and they saw it as a duty to have descendants, what they'd received from their ancestors. They saw it not only as a duty to have descendants, but it was also, again, common sense, because who was going to look after you in your old age if you got that far? Well, you needed children.
Yeah, there was a duty to take care of your elders as well.
Yes, and that's
most of the time,
right down to, well, really pretty much to the present, but it's fading scarily now, partly because they're so numerous and they're living so long, and partly because, and this is going to get much worse in the future, because we've had so few children, and all the indicators are going in the opposite direction. That older people are going to be considered a cramping nuisance, as a burden upon the young and those who can work.
Some of them already are, but
yes,
we won't mention that.
Thank you very much for that. Right. Well, moving swiftly on, Roger Scruton, who just died a year or two ago, was very unusual in still adhering, basically, I think, to this view. And in his absolutely wonderful essay on Rousseau, which is online, by the way, and I do recommend people to just look it up, type in Roger Scruton on Rousseau. It's absolutely brilliant. But he makes basically this same point. He expresses this pre-modern idea. The dead and the unborn are as much members of society as the living. To dishonor the dead is to reject the relation on which society is built, the relation of obligation between generations, right, that run in all directions.
I feel like this doesn't fit very well with the individualistic paradigm that we're living in now.
No, it doesn't fit at all. This is now long gone. Roger Scruton and I are very unusual in wanting to go into bat for precisely this in the present. At least in the West we are. Outside it, no, there'll be many more. Now, Edmund Burke, very, very influential Anglo-Irish politician and thinker, expressed this brilliantly. The view that he's about to express here, that we're going to read now, was coming to be considered conservative, not necessarily by everybody in Britain and Ireland at the time he said it, but by people of his class. Most of them had become modern. So he's kind of speaking up for the older view. He was someone who had supported or been very supportive of the American Revolution. But the French Revolution, he thought, was of a completely different temper. And he produced his famous book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was castigating it and saying that it would lead to massive bloodshed. With revolutionaries, he says, it's a sufficient motive to destroy an old scheme of things because it is an old one. As to the new, there is no sort of fear with regard to the duration of a building run up in haste, because duration is no object to those who think little or nothing has been done before their time, and who place all their hopes in discovery. Discovery, not quite in our sense, slightly old-fashioned, but innovation. A spirit of innovation. Now, this will really run against the way that we've been brought up to think. A spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views. Now, he's expressing there the older idea that what you should do is not innovate. Well, he's not saying no innovation, but having a kind of an innovatory spirit, constantly be itching to bring in new things, is bad. It means that you're self-centered. You're vaunting your own judgment against the tried and tested methods and ideas that have been passed down to us from our heritage. So that means you are selfish. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Now, that sentence might almost be taken as incredibly prescient. I think if we'd been reading this during the 100 or 150 years after he wrote it, we would have said he was wrong on that point. Because in the 19th century and the early 20th, the West was dominated by ideologues who did look forward to posterity. They wanted to create a future in line with their ideology, for the sake of which they were prepared to burn not only the past, but the present as well. Enormous sacrifices should be made for the sake of making a brave and wonderful new world in the future. Think of Marxism, for example. From where we stand, he now looks to have been absolutely correct, because we're now in a position where that whole process has worked its way through, and nobody believes in those ideologies anymore because they resulted in catastrophe. And we can scarcely imagine even what the lives of our own children will look like, though we have dark forebodings, perhaps. And we certainly find it hard to motivate ourselves to make a better world for the future. So we just live for ourselves.
Yeah, not exactly a view that encourages having children.
Well, yeah, that's part of that.
Right, yeah, that's what you were alluding to, is that that's now a very modern problem that we're having.
Right, right. I mean, having children now is, in some ways, a vote of confidence, or at least, it's hard to have confidence, but at least of hope in the future.
I think a lot of this maybe can be, and this is maybe more philosophical than we really want to be, but that maybe a lot of this could be traced to sort of a growing fear, or simultaneously a growing hopelessness that things are going to get better, and people are feeling like, well, we don't really know, or there's just, well, maybe with a shrinking worldview as well, that
Yes,
that people are just feeling less excited about the future.
right. Yes. I mean, this was very evident in the British general election, which happened yesterday as we were recording this. So maybe 10 days ago, or so, when you're listening to it, or longer if you're listening to it on YouTube 2 or 3 years from now, right? The only instinct that there was widespread amongst the public was complete determination to get rid of the existing government because they weren't satisfied with it. And despite its huge majority in the Commons, the incoming government, the Labour government, only got just over a third of the vote. It got fewer votes than it did back in 2019 when it lost resoundingly. Loads of people simply didn't turn out. And very high proportion of the population voted for different parties. And the overwhelming view expressed again and again on the doorsteps by to all manner of canvassers and journalists and what have you is, we're fed up, we're angry, but we have no idea what to do, and we have zero confidence that any of them can make any of this better. And that's a growing sense, I think, across a lot of Western countries right now, including America, I would contend. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, modern people have come to see things differently. The 18th century sees the birth of what we call the progress myth. And that is the idea that the world is getting better and better, not always in the short term. It doesn't deny the fact that there can be catastrophes and so on. For example, 18th century people despised the Western Middle Ages. We basically get the expression the Middle Ages from them. They admired Greece and Rome, and they see the ages since as being a large reversion, and themselves as picking up the torch and moving forward again. But in the long term, they see human history as an unstoppable march of progress. And on that view, our ancestors were misguided and unjust. Right? They were misguided practically, and they were unjust morally. We're better, and we need to free ourselves from their beliefs and practices. Now, in different ways, that was true of all the modernist creeds, the various ideologies, but also of a growing general sensibility amongst modern Western publics, even those that didn't necessarily subscribe to any tightly circumscribed set of political or intellectual beliefs. So they saw their duty was to make a better humanity and a better future, for the sake of which hardships may need to be borne and violence perpetrated in the present. So this is certainly characteristic of all of the ideologies born out of the 18th century Enlightenment, particularly one thinks of nationalism and socialism, right? The various European imperialisms, the British imperialism, it was okay that they were going to dominate the world because they were making everything better. They were bringing people civilization at the point of a gun, as indeed Napoleon had done in his own mind.
Would any of this happen to coincide with evolution, the theory of evolution gaining popularity?
Yes. This is one of the reasons that it has such rapid take up, because it chimes perfectly with what people were thinking anyway about social relations, political structures, and so on. And the idea of evolution always towards the higher. Right? The fact that human beings are the highest, and who gets to judge that? Well, human beings is that's not a point we can follow now. But yes, it just fits perfectly within that whole paradigm. Yes.
Right.
So when we come to Tom Paine, who was Edmund Burke's great antagonist, he said that Burke was, I don't think he exactly called him a fool, but he called him everything short of that. In his own book, Rights of Man, which was his riposte to Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. Now, in America, this, of course, is news, because Americans who know about Tom Paine, they see him as the author of one other crucial book, which was
Common Sense.
Common Sense, right, written at the time of the American Revolution. Now, the great thing about Paine is that he has such a breezy style of writing. He's so easy to read. It could have been written yesterday morning, and it's forceful. So when I was an unsuspecting college student, you think you had it bad under me? My gosh, I had some blooming Marxist pushing me along, and we had to read Edmund Burke and then Paine's riposte to him, and our professor made it absolutely plain to us that Burke was an idiot, and of course Paine was right. Every generation is, as Paine said, competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It's the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. Well, that seemed very commonsensical. He thought that the French Revolution would turn out absolutely spiffingly, just like the American. But who was right, eh? Because within a year or 2 years of those two books being written, what happens? Well, 1793 and the Great Terror, and thousands of people being guillotined. for being enemies or just imagined enemies of the revolution. And the Vendée, the uprising of peasants, traditionalists in the western part of France, the French countryside, who didn't want this stuff and being completely butchered by their new tolerant modernist masters. So, of course, that wasn't something that my professor pointed out to us. But in terms of predicting the way things were going to go with the French Revolution, who was right? Well, obviously, it was Burke. Right. Now, in Why the Rest Hates the West, in discussing all of this, I venture the view that Christian postmillennialism, we'll explain in a moment, dear listeners, what that is, in case you're not sure, was a religious borrowing from the secular progress myth. In fact, I think I say something like postmillennialism was simply Christian words set to a secular tune. I say this was by P.S. Garçon, the boy, because I have since been given serious pause for thought as to whether I was right about this. I'm not sure even now. John Gray, one of the foremost political philosophers in the world, the author of dozens of books, in his book Black Mass, argues the opposite. He says that the secular progress myth was a rationalist borrowing from Christian postmillennialism. Now, John Gray is an atheist, but a very friendly one, and an atheist so consistent that he actually finds himself pretty sympathetic to Christians a lot of the time, which is ironic and interesting. A very, very stimulating thinker. He says that the trouble with the progress myth is that it's simply taking Christian apocalypticism, secularizing it, and then imposing that as the meaning and the direction of history, and we know what it is. He might be right. Okay, in favour of Gray's argument is the undoubted, and from my point of view, embarrassing fact that postmillennialism predates the secular progress myth. So maybe Gray's right. Right? Postmillennialism makes its first appearance in the world in the 1610s. In the middle of the 17th century, it was widely believed in, particularly by religious and political radicals, including people like Oliver Cromwell, but also including a load of absolute nutcases. However, after that, it settled down and became the received opinion amongst large numbers of Protestants generally and evangelicals in particular. Well, let's take a look at this. So what is postmillennialism? It's the idea that there'll be a 1,000-year reign of the saints on the earth. Now, that's believed by premillennials as well. But Christ returns only after that. So postmillennialists believe in a post, after the millennium, second coming of Christ. So that means the millennium comes first. So who brings in the reign of the saints on the earth? The saints. Right? Now, in the nutcase job amongst some people in the middle of the 17th century, that meant the saints as designated by themselves seizing political power. Right? In the more sober and sane version, the Wesley brothers, Jonathan Edwards, and many more besides, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this meant making the world entirely Christian, sponsoring the missionary movement, evangelizing all over the world, and that God would cause this to happen. If you're not wild about postmillennialism, and I'm not, one of the many embarrassments, but if you don't like being embarrassed, whatever you do, don't study history, is the fact that postmillennialism was an important motivating factor behind the birth of the modern evangelical missionary movement. Okay, so in the 18th century, however mistaken this theology may be, it falls into the hands of perfectly respectable and eminently sensible people and ends up doing, accidentally, an awful lot of good. So the idea, as I say, emerged in the early 17th century, widely held during the English Civil War period, mostly by radicals, but the dominant view among 18th and early 19th century Protestants, especially evangelical.
Yeah, and the reason that this distinction matters between your previous theory and Gray's theory, which one came first, either postmillennialism or the progress myth.
Right.
The reason that distinction matters so much is because it has implications even for today, whether the progress myth is a Christian idea.
Yes. 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 I would
Right.
argue that there certainly is like a consonance between the two ideas. I've mentioned one important piece of evidence which favours Gray over me. I would point out, however, that lots of the people pushing this during the 18th century, particularly French philosophes, certainly weren't Protestants, and this did not take hold amongst Catholics. They had a Catholic background, and I strongly suspect that someone like Voltaire, even though he spent time in England and admired England and wrote about it, uh, I strongly suspect that he wouldn't even have known what this was. So I think from the most influential people, it is coming simply on rationalist grounds. But that there is a consonance between the two can't be doubted. I think my own hesitations are such now that if there were a second edition of Why the Rest, I would either simply knock those passages out or say that the two were simply consonant with one another and leave it at that. Okay, let's see what Gray has to say about the rationalist ideologies as failed utopian visions. Postmillennialism, he says, mutated into the Enlightenment belief that humanity is an inherently progressive species. The philosophers of the Enlightenment aimed to supplant Christianity, but they could do so only if they were able to satisfy the hopes it had implanted. As a result, they could not admit that human history has no overall meaning. Now, Gray is an atheist. He thinks that history has no overall meaning. Right? Christians of all shades do not agree with him. But only a few are actually postmillennialists, especially now. It's trying to think if there's some exceptions to this. It's mostly retreated to a crankish fringe these days. I'm sure we'll have rude comments on YouTube about that fact from some outraged postmillennialist who's watching this.
Right.
Many modern thinkers have tried to avoid a view of history as a battle of good and evil, and instead presented it as a series of stages, kind of like some idea of history as a sort of science. Now, Marxists love this. That's the way they talked all the time. In this view, human knowledge advances in cumulative fashion, and so do improvements in ethics and politics. Are there improvements in ethics? I think this may be doubted. Anyway, but modernists thought so. Progress in science will be matched by progress in society, and history is a march to a better world. There's no mention here of any final battle, but it has proved impossible to avoid apocalyptic thinking. By maintaining that the crimes of history are the result of error, Enlightenment philosophers create a problem of evil as insoluble as any that confronts Christian theologians. I told you he was moderately sympathetic to us sometimes, right? Right. He thinks that the problem of evil is insoluble in Christian theology. But yeah, it's certainly a problem and an important one. But he thinks that the Enlightenment philosophers' stance is far worse, far more insoluble. Why are humans so fond of error? In struggling to answer these questions, Enlightenment thinkers cannot help falling back into a view of history as a battle between light and dark. The light may be that of knowledge and the darkness that of ignorance, but the view of the world is the same. Modern political religions may reject Christianity, but they cannot do without demonology. The Jacobins, the most radical of the French revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, and the Nazis all believed vast conspiracies were mounted against them, as do radical Islamists today. It's never the flaws of human nature that stand in the way of utopia. Now we're on ground where we might agree with him rather more. Right?
Hmm.
It's the workings of evil forces. He doesn't believe that, of course. He's describing the modernist view. Right? Ultimately, these dark forces will fail, but only after they've tried to block human advance by every nefarious device. This is the classic millenarian syndrome, and in the forms in which they've shaped modern politics, the millenarian and the utopian mentality are one and the same. That's a pretty crushing analysis of modern political ideologies, but I think he's pretty much right on the money there.
Yeah, if you had to summarize what he's saying here in a few words.
You think that's going to be too densely packed set of ideas for some of our viewers or what? Basically, he's saying that modernist ideologies have created a battle between light and dark as they want to insist, which is exactly the same as the Christianity they'd set out to replace. They are certain that the
Right.
world is getting better and better, and they know the way to do it and what it should look like and how to get there and the stages along it and all the rest of it. But of course, that never happens, and they're constantly locked in battles. If I ever finish my magnum opus, which may be doubted, which will look at this story. One of the points I would make, and I made it in my valedictory lecture in Houghton, which you can probably look up online if you're feeling particularly suffering from insomnia or something like that. I make the point that the worst position for nationalism and socialism was immediately after they obtained massive success at the end of World War One. Now their programs could be put into effect. But of course they couldn't be. And utopia failed to arrive in both cases. And they simply became ultra radicalized because they were certain that there were conspiracies against them. So 19th century liberal nationalism mutated into fascism and even Nazism in attempts to root out ethnic minorities and enemies of the pure nation state and all the rest of it. And socialism simply went through purge after purge after purge because somebody had to be to blame for the fact that the economy wasn't working. It couldn't possibly be that socialism didn't work. Right? And that's what he's really describing for us here. These are utopian and millenarian.
Right. So basically, these enlightened people, he's sort of maybe making fun of them a little bit, or maybe we are, that you definitely are, that we're so enlightened and we've evolved, beyond the need for religion and good and evil and all of these things. But really, they find themselves making the same arguments or in the same sort
Right.
of circles that
Yes.
that religious people would be
Yes.
in.
We are seeing, are we, why I tend to want to put enlightenment in quotation marks every time I use it. Endarkenment
Yes.
might be better. I mean, it wouldn't be better. What I mean is, might be a more accurate term, let me put it that way. Okay, so this is
Yes.
widely believed in, not just at the level of people who are absolutely hooked on ideologies, but ordinary people who think that they're spouting common sense. In the 19th century, certainly in Britain and America, I mean, in our next slide here, we've got this famous late 19th century painting, American Progress by John Gust, expressing this popular belief in manifest destiny. So marching forward westwards across the prairies, bringing agriculture, driving out the savages, bringing settlement and order and railroads and all this kind of stuff, right? So better and better.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in a previous episode as well. And I think this was even when we were talking about postmillennialism, that it's sort of part of American history that we feel like we're the chosen people. We have this particular mission from God to spread out and make the world wonderful, I guess. So is this tied into that, or this
Yes.
is getting away from that?
Yes. It's at one level, it's kind of like an endearing collective self-delusion. At another level, it's extremely
Right.
dangerous because it means that one will attempt to dominate a world that doesn't want to be dominated, and people can tell themselves, but this is the right thing to do, and we're going to help them despite themselves. Or virtually all modern ideologues told themselves that. That's why they were so happy to kill people to create their bright new tomorrow. But what can be said in favour of it? Well, this can be said in favour that it is at least a hopeful vision for oneself and one's own society. It would be far better turned
Right.
inward, as it were, towards America itself than seeking to make the rest of the world like oneself. And I would worry that now, as in so much of the rest of Western countries, the other Western countries, that pessimism is setting in, self-loathing is rampant, and we're now going to move towards the opposite. And America is moving towards isolationism. And of course, what's needed is neither American domination nor American isolation, but responsible participation in the world. And that
Yeah.
will make a happier America and a happier everybody else. but hitting that middle,
Right.
people are not very good at hitting the middle.
No.
Well, we're not really living in that world anymore. Almost nobody, I think, really under about 60, or perhaps maybe older than that, seriously believes in inevitable progress anymore. Very, very few people, I would think, except perhaps in the area of technology, which kind of builds upon itself. So it's worth asking what's caused the decline of the progress myth. Well, I'd point to several factors. Firstly, the world wars. The First World War completely shattered people's confidence, though it was rebuilt afterwards, often in a rather bloody-minded fashion. But it really shook people that these were the most developed countries in the world, and they had waged war on one another using all the tools of modern industry to devastating effect and killing, well, around 9 to 10 million people. And then 20 years later, along comes World War II, and it kills 55 to 60 million people. So collectively, this is like a huge electric shock. There's nothing inevitable about it. And our wonderful progress, including in technology, industry, science, and so on, can simply be turned against us. And of course, this is the kind of argument that C.S. Lewis used in his amazing book, The Abolition of Man, which is worth reading for so many reasons. But he points out that a lot of what we call man's domination of nature is simply the domination of some men by other men using nature as their instrument. And he gives some examples of that, right? Including the machine gun and the fighter aircraft and so on. Secondly, the prospect of nuclear Armageddon during the Cold War. That could simply annihilate the planet. And that has never completely gone away. If anything, it's crept a little nearer again in the last 2 or 3 years. But certainly that was the shadow under which people living in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s lived. And that rendered the idea of inevitable progress increasingly incredible. But also, and this has been a growing consciousness since the 1970s, the looming, and now it's upon us, the present environmental crisis. Finally, we're burning up the Earth's resources. We've created a climate crisis. We're running out of all kinds of raw materials. And of course, as soon as we think about it, indefinite economic expansion into finity doesn't make any kind of sense. That's simply not even a coherent concept. And in practice, we're seeing the end of perpetual economic growth in Western societies, at least, and of rising living standards. It's at least arguable that living standards in most Western countries haven't risen in a generation now. Some people want to argue, particularly in respect of America, 2 generations. Yes, there has been massive improvements in many other parts of the world, but even that may be stalling now. So it's very, very hard to believe in inevitable progress. So what do postmodern people believe? Well, they disbelieve in tradition, just like modernists did. They consider it unjust, stupid, wrong, and they disbelieve in progress, disproved by the catastrophes of the 20th century and looming environmental disaster. So the conclusion, well, look around, this is what people are doing. They live just for the present. They engage in single issue politics because they don't believe in any of the big stories anymore. I'll just take 2 examples: laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. Right, the number of people who seriously and consistently believe in those things is collapsed. Right, they believe in single issue politics, grievance politics, identity politics, hedonism, a loss of identity and direction, which itself feeds identity fetishes and politics, and apathy. As I like to say, I know this is particularly polemical, but I'm altogether too good at that. What do people live for if they no longer believe, as fulfilling Burke's prophecy, if they no longer believe in tradition, the past, or the future? What's left? Basically, sex and shopping. That's it. And welcome to the 21st century West. That's where we are.
Right. Yeah, I think coming full circle to what we were saying earlier, this is not the sort of worldview that promotes hopefulness or having children or honoring your ancestors or any of those
Right,
things.
right. And it really is not necessary to start endorsing, oh, I don't know, slavery or imperialism or the subjection of women or anything like that, to say, actually, tradition really, really matters. And it's something we can build our individual and collective lives around, and it will make us better as a people.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
our next slide is not necessarily mocking Darwin, but it is mocking the idea of inevitable progress.
I think my favorite part is the McDonald's
Is that what he's eating?
bag in hand.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
right. Oh, yeah, okay, yes. My God.
My family still talks about the time not too long ago that we visited you in Croatia and simply would not allow us to try Croatian McDonald's,
No,
despite the
no, no, no.
fact that several of us wanted to.
That's quite right. Um, I'm afraid the curse has come here. Although, well, 2 things I would say. One is that even in McDonald's, appalling though the fare there is, it's still many times better than what you will get in one in the US. It does serve salads, for goodness sake. And I strongly suspect that particularly the meat, or what passes for meat, the pink slime in US McDonald's, would not be saleable here and probably not even legal.
Right, right.
But the other thing, of course, about Croatia is that aside, virtually all of the restaurants are one-offs. They are family-owned businesses or something like that. Whereas, you or I could scroll out a map of, I don't know, Oregon or somewhere that neither of us has ever been, find a mid-sized town, and we could accurately predict which restaurants would be in that town because it's the same everywhere.
Right. Yes,
We're
yes.
getting way off track here, right? Okay. Although maybe McDonald's is the sign of. Anyway, we're not going to go there. Right. Let's do a little summarizing here. So, comparing traditional, modern, and postmodern views about the origin of humanity, the human past, the present, and the future. So, traditional people posited a golden age and then a fall from that. Of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's the idea of Eden and then some kind of moral fall. Right? But there are parallels to that idea in traditional cultures generally. As for the past, well, that is the source of tradition. That's where we get it from. As for the present, our own situation, well, our duty is to maintain tradition. The future is the danger of falling away from it. So we need to fence against that. For modern people, well, sometimes, not always. We can hear of Tom Paine on the one hand and Karl Marx on the other. They posited a golden age in the past and then a fall into tradition. That the tradition was the fall. So that the past was unjust, stupid, and wrong. The present had to be revolutionary to destroy all of that. And the future, we would create a golden age again. And postmodern people, well, human origins, something very crude and basic. The past, unjust, stupid, and wrong. The present, good as it gets. Nah. And the future, who knows, probably not good. So, yes, a climate of pessimism, as you say.
Right. Yeah, I love this slide because I feel like it summarizes perfectly. Just you can almost see, like it's screaming at you that there's just a loss of purpose over time. You know, in the traditional sense, people had lots of things to live for. You know, nobody was asking the question, what is my purpose in life? Because they had, you know, an entire structure to fall back on. And then over time, I feel like you can just see, as we start to strip things away, a complete loss of that, until now you have what we have today, which is, like you said, people walking around going, well, what's the point?
Yes, that's exactly right. In the past, even for a lot of modernity, at least amongst ordinary people, they would have laughed at you if you'd said, well, what's my purpose in life? You know, this is like, who am I? This is a question for Plato and Aristotle and people like that. Ordinary people, they know unreflectively is probably the most important word. They knew it unreflectively because it had never been for a moment in doubt who they were and what the meaning of their life was, both as individuals and collective. And indeed, those two things couldn't have been separated either because they were all bound up together. Whereas now, every semi-literate 15-year-old kid is asking it and driving themselves crazy about it or suffering mental illness of one kind or another precisely because of this. Now, when non-Westerners look at the West, they see all of that quite clearly. And they see that what they have is immediately threatened by it. And so when we, not you and I personally, but our collective organs through various busybody agencies of one kind or another are anxious to turn everybody in the world to look like us, that is hugely resented. Right? Now the Islamist terrorist is on one horrible extreme of that resentment. But there are hundreds of millions, indeed thousands of millions of people who would never do that or anything like it, but nevertheless feel extremely threatened. And Westerners do themselves no service if they don't understand that. And also recognize that the non-Westerners may well be right, and that maybe we could do with putting a little of our own house in order.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there you go, people. We're done preaching with you for today. But thank you for staying with us. Thank you for staying with us this long. Next week, we're going to be considering an even more controversial subject, which is that of human rights, which is another idea distinctive to the modern West, and discussing it with the inestimable Andy Bannister, who's going to be joining us for a general sloshing around session. So we hope you'll enjoy that too.
Yeah, if you want the chance to see Mike really and thoroughly roasted, next week will be the episode to see
Are you
that.
saying you're too gentle?
It's worth watching.
You're saying you're too gentle? Is
Yeah.
that it? Ha!
Well,
Fie, madam.
you know. Andy's just a lot better at it.
Ah, yeah, that is true. Yes, but he's had centuries of practice, really.
Right.
Okay, so if we hope you enjoyed this. If you do, please do like and subscribe and repost on social media. Recommend to your friends. If there are things that you weren't happy with or that you want to ask us about, please post questions or make criticisms or what have you on YouTube or Spotify or indeed on our Facebook page. We love to hear from you. So thank you very much. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Bye bye now.